Hey everyone, this is William Roberts, and welcome to week 9 of Chords A to Z. So in all of these different lessons, we've basically been, starting from the absolute basics when it comes to chords, so talking about power chords and two-part harmony. And from that point, we've tried to, kind of create this approach where we're getting every single little thing as we go on, right? It's comprehensive. So we started with the basics, and as we started with the basics, we've basically moved through, it's hard to say what the exact progression of, learning chords and learning harmony on guitar is, but this is, in my mind at least, kind of a natural progression of things that, you learn one after another, right? So we learned power chords and all our different types of power chords. Then we learned all of our different first position chords. Then we talked about inversions and the type of inversions that you'll encounter within the first position. And then from there, we moved on to bar chords, and we did a lot of the same that we did within the first position chords. So within bar chords, we looked at just your normal major and minor chords, and then we talked about how we can invert those and what kind of sounds we can get out of that. And then we talked about seventh chords, major seventh chords, minor seven chords, dominant seven chords, and then we even talked about the area of diminished last week, right? And that is the one area too that it's not that it doesn't, appear in modern music or anything, but it can sometimes be the most difficult to grasp because you're really dealing with, a lot of tension. But like I said, it's still a very integral part of a lot of modern music. If you like the Beatles, you definitely like diminished chords because they do appear within there. So it's just basically depending on, your musical style and your ability. And I know the diminished chords could still be, a little difficult, and I emphasize that throughout the lesson. So don't worry if that one lesson was kind of really tripping you up a little bit more than the others. It's very natural, and diminished chords kind of take a while to really perceive and understand. And so what we're going to do this week, not this chord, what we're going to do for chords this week is we're actually going to be talking about what I like to call upper structure chords or higher register chords. So this isn't, a shared definition among every guitar player, but basically all I'm talking about within this context is in all of our previous lessons and kind of views within the guitar, when we were talking about bar chords, we were basing it off of a root note on the E string or root note on the A string, which is great. And not only is that great, for the reasons that, it gives us a bunch of different chords that we can play, and we can figure out how to, we have two options for every chord based on that system, right? Which is awesome. But a lot of times, I don't want to play something that has a lot of these lower register notes. You'll notice there's certain styles of music where somebody's playing chords a little bit higher up on the guitar that have some more, higher register information, and it sounds really nice, right? And especially if you play in a band with two guitar players, and it could be any configuration. It could be a modern rock band where you have two heavily distorted guitars. It could be, kind of a modern folk acoustic but Americana band where there's one like electric guitar that's, like a Telecaster or something, and then there's an acoustic guitar, and you want, when you're playing the Telecaster, you want to highlight some kind of upper structure stuff while the acoustic guitar is strumming down low. There's a lot of different applications for this, and this is a really important part of guitar. So what we're going to be talking about today is just how we can voice our major chords and our minor chords all up on the top four strings of the guitar. So our D string, our G string, our B string, and our E string. And in doing this, you'll kind of see the stylistic choices that I can make and why I might use a chord like this. Because the more and more that I play in bands, if I was to play in a 3-person band, I would probably, stick to these full position chords. But since I end up playing with a lot of piano players or other guitar players or just in large ensembles in general, a lot of times I want to occupy less territory and I want to be a little bit more specific with my note choice. And in doing that, these voicings are really, really great because I can be a little bit higher. So if I'm playing with a piano player and they're kind of playing the chords a little bit lower down on the piano, right around middle C, I can add some kind of higher quality information or, higher register information that's not going to conflict with what they're doing. So this is kind of an important way of thinking through that. And like I said, these show up in a lot of different contexts, and I'll talk about that as I go on. So to start off, I'm basically going to talk about how I can voice just this major chord. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to break it down. You're going to see it's extremely closely related, if not, exactly related to our normal bar chord positions. So let's take G major, and we're just going to play our G major bar chord, the one that's based off of a root note on the E string, right? So G is our 3rd fret of our E string. And our G major chord looks like this. So to play this, I have my first finger here on the 3rd fret of the low E string. I have my ring finger here on the 5th fret of the A string. I have my pinky here on the 5th fret of the D string. My middle finger is here on the 4th fret of the G string, and then my first finger is barring on the 3rd fret of the B and E. And hopefully too, the more and more you've played this, and the more we've talked about barring, hopefully you've been able to kind of see how we can flatten our finger and really try to get all of those different notes ringing out. Again, the exercise that I've given to people who have had trouble with barring is, first I'm just going to try to play 2 notes on the B and E string, right, our thinnest strings, so that should be the easiest bar we could do. Now I'll try to include the G, now the D, now the A, and now the E, right? So as we go on through all those different notes, it'll get progressively harder, but it'll also train us, once we can do from low E to high E, that's, you know, as much barring as you could possibly do. So it's a very great kind of progressive system to getting your fingers a little bit more comfortable for barring. Anyway, we have this normal G major position, and again, this is great, but you can hear it has a lot of the frequency spectrum, right? There's 2 octaves of G in it, right? I have G down here, G here, and G here. That's a lot of, you know, notes to be covering. That's a lot of, you know, territory to be occupying. So I'm going to do this chord. So if you notice, all I'm doing here is I'm imagining this little, you know, basically from my pinky finger on, I'm imagining that as my voicing. And you can hear, all of a sudden it's got a lot more, it's got a higher sound to it, right? I'm not hearing that low power chord that's within the chord anymore. So now if I'm playing with a piano player who's playing something kind of down here, I can play up here and it works with each other, right? So to play this, I'm going to change my fingerings up for this. I have my ring finger here on the 5th fret of the D string. I have my middle finger here on the 4th fret of the G string. And then my first finger is going to be the only one barring on the 3rd fret of B and the 3rd fret of E, right? And here, let me just check my tuning real quick again. Always important to be doing. And also you'll find on guitar, you know, it's an imperfect instrument. Chords are always going to be slightly out of tune, so just learning to play with that, learning to tolerate that is just going to be a part of becoming familiar with the instrument. Cool, that sounds better. So we have our G major chord, right? Again, all that is, it's just the top part of this chord. And you can hear the difference. It's the same notes, but I just don't have that kind of low chest that I have in that G chord, right? Which is very important for different styles of music. So that's how I would voice this G major. So okay, let's do the same thing now for this G minor chord, right? So this is how we were playing our G minor bar. Again, I'm barring my first finger from the low E string up to the high E string. I have my ring finger here on the 5th fret of the A. I have my pinky here on the 5th fret of the D. And I'm strumming up the entirety of the guitar. Again, three different G's alone, right? I have G down here, G up here, and then G even above that. So again, that's a pretty wide, you know, if I was to think about that on a piano, that would cover a lot of ground, right? That would be about that much of a hand's worth, even though that's kind of a weird reference for, you know, the breadth of notes. But anyway, you can hear there's a lot of different, you know, a lot of the different frequency spectrum is represented. This is almost getting into bass territory on your guitar. And up here, this is getting into some, you know, really higher quality, you know, higher register stuff. So if I wanted to simplify this, if I wanted to play something that was a little bit shorter, a little bit smaller, and didn't occupy as much space, but still kind of had that higher register stuff, I could do this chord. Again, it's the same thought process when I was playing this chord, right? When I was doing my major chord and then switching up to this, I'm just taking this exact voice in and I'm playing from the D string up to the high E string. So that's how I'm thinking through this. So to play that, I'm going to have my ring finger here on the 5th fret of the D string, and now my first finger is going to bar the G string, B string, and E string 3rd fret. One thing you can also do is you can bar the 4th fret of the D string, and this would actually make a minor 7 chord, and next week we're going to be talking about the same exact concept but with more of our minor 7 chords, major 7 chords, all that stuff. But anyway, if I bar it, I can do this little motion. And this is part of what we're going to be talking about today is another reason that it's really nice to use these kind of higher level chords is because my pinky's free so I can do all this different stuff. But I do have this option to hammer on here too if I wanted that to be part of the sound of my chord, right? So it gives the harmony a very living and breathing feeling. So again, my major chord was here, and I was just saying, let me take these top 4 notes of the chord and let me reposition it so that the fingering's a little bit more comfortable and it frees up one of my fingers. Same thing with this minor chord, right? It was just my standard minor chord, and I said, now I want to play up from the D string to the high E string of this chord, and again, I'm going to switch up my fingerings so that I have my pinky free. So that's how I'm thinking through the major and minor chord based off of a root note on the E string, right? So now let's think about a root note on the A string. And for our purposes, I'll just go to C, since it's right here, we'll be in the same position that we're working in. So starting with a major chord, this one's going to be a little interesting, because if we think about it, so if you notice, when we were playing this chord, we weren't playing the high E string, right? So we have 2 options here, and I'm going to talk about the 2 options. Now, if we wanted to, be technical with this, I could actually do this. Because, if you notice, this is the 5th, right? This 3rd string of the high E string is within the chord. We usually just don't play it because, finding, since we're barring with this finger, it would be very awkward to have to bar with this finger and then have this bar come up just in time for the E string to ring out. You can hear, even if I'm doing that fingering, I kind of have to readjust, and I would, I would do some alternate fingering if I had to have these couple of notes all playing together. So, what we can do is we can reposition our hand so that I have my middle finger here on the 5th fret of D, my ring finger here on the 5th fret of G, my first finger here on the 5th fret of B, and then my first finger here on the 3rd fret of that high G. So you'll notice this is kind of an interesting stretch, right? And it's also, now we're technically playing an inversion. So with those other chords we were playing, the root note was still G, right? In both of those contexts. Now, the root note is no longer C. The root note is actually G again, right? So it's the 5th of C, so this is technically a second inversion G chord, right? Because the 5th is on the bottom. Now my caveat with this, and the reason I want to show you a different fingering and chord, is because this is great. The only thing is, I don't think I've actually ever played that voicing in any context other than just demonstrating it. So the reason I want to give you another voicing is because while this is great, it's a little difficult to get to. You might even be struggling to kind of get this fingering down, because getting this stretch between your first finger and the rest of your fingers is definitely a challenge, and with some of our, kind of bigger extended chords, those stretches can be difficult. So in my mind, as great as this is, I've never really used it, and I've really never had a purpose for it. The only context I could think of is if somebody was saying, very specifically, you need to voice a C major chord, but you need to have a 5th in the top, right? Which, for most of our purposes, we're not really going to need to worry too much about that. So again, this is a usable voicing, but the voicing I would use is actually just going to be a 3-note voicing, and all it is it's just going to say, let's ignore that top E string and play these 3 notes, right? So all I'm doing here is I'm putting my first finger here on the 5th fret of the D string, 5th fret of the G string, 5th fret of the E string, and I'm just barring across, and then I'm not playing the high E string. You'll notice that it went from taking 1 finger to play to 4 fingers to play, right? Huge difference. So this chord's way easier to get to, and also the difference in sound. Is it really that much better? I don't think so, to have that 5th on top. I don't really think it matters. So again, I'm just going to end up doing this voicing. And I could even throw, if you notice, I have a C up here. So I could do this. I don't really like the sound of this voicing particularly either, but that's my personal taste. So I do have all these different versions of doing this top version of our standard C triad, right? I could do this first way, which again is a little difficult, but definitely usable if you find a context for it. We have this one, which is what I'll use 99.9% of the times if I need to, because it just takes 1 finger and it frees up all my fingers to do these little trills and stuff, which we'll talk about. And then also, if I wanted to, I could throw my pinky in there to get C on top. I don't particularly love the sound of this one, so again, I don't really use it, but it is an option if it's something that you want to do. So those are our 3 different contexts for thinking about this major bar chord position that we're now hopefully familiar with, and how we can kind of make this, top level thing where we're ignoring our A string, so it's really just, kind of the higher content. So now let's do that same exact thing for minor, and this one's actually going to be a little bit more straightforward. We're just going to do the same thing in this context that we were doing for all of our chords based off of a root note on the E string. So to play our standard minor chord voicing, I have my first finger here on the 3rd fret of the A string. I have my ring finger here on the 5th fret of the D. I have my pinky here on the 5th fret of the G. My first finger is playing the 4th fret of the B string, and then the high E string is also the 5th fret, and my first finger is barring that. So that was our standard C minor bar chord, and all I'm going to do now in this context is basically just ignore this first note right on C, on the A string, and I'm just going to take my first finger over here to play the 3rd fret of the high E string. So you can see, it's only one note different, but it should be a lot easier to play theoretically now because I don't have to worry about barring. And again, that's a much more, this major bar chord was the only one where we had to do a little bit of thinking to figure out, what it would look like since we weren't playing the high E string. With all these other ones, because we are playing the high E string, and they're relatively easy voicings to kind of transfer over to just, the top 4 notes, all we have to do is think, what are the top 4 notes that I'm playing? Okay, how can I kind of reconfigure that so that, it feels a little bit more comfortable? And again, that's the context with it, right? So that's all we were doing within this, whole exercise and this whole thought process was saying, how can I take, my standard major chord that was playing all 6 strings or, was playing from the A string on, how can I take those and just play the top 4 notes so, it has a little bit more of a higher, higher register sound to it, and it gives me some flexibility to do more stuff around the guitar. So another reason that we talk about this and these chords are extremely useful is because you'll notice it frees up your pinky. And so let me show you, so this is something that was really, really, big with people like Jimi Hendrix, and he was not the only person to do it. If you listen to any of the old school Motown records, any of the old Michael Jackson records or the Jackson 5 records, there's always going to be guitar players that are, incorporating the style, and it's definitely continued now. And it's where, I'm going to throw in all these kind of trills and fills while holding a chord in place. It's almost kind of taking something that would be associated with a piano player where they play a chord in their left hand and then they can kind of play a melody in their right hand. When we think about chords this way, we can now start to do this stuff with our pinky finger. So let me take this G chord, right? And now I'm going to do the fingering that we just came up with when we wanted to play the top 4 notes of the G chord. And all I'm doing here is now that I have my pinky free, you're going to notice all of the notes on the 5th fret work within the chord. So all I did right there is I played the entire chord, and then while the notes are ringing out, I just walked with my pinky down and did 5th fret, then lifted it, 5th fret, lifted it, 5th fret, lifted it, because every time I lift it, it's just going to hit one of these other chord tones. Right? It has a really cool sound, even when it, there's a lot of, modern players too who have taken this very kind of old school interpretation of how you play rhythm guitar, and they've put it in this whole new context where, all of a sudden they're like these virtuosic rhythm players, which is a really, really interesting kind of, kind of thing to associate with harmony on a guitar. I can do the same thing going up. So all I'm doing there you can hear, right? It sounds like this single note melody that's happening, but since I'm holding the chord in place, all the notes are ringing out while I do it. And in that case, I was going up and down, so. Now, this stuff can conceptually be a little bit of a jump for people, and also technically and physically, just because a lot of times, even if you are comfortable with your scales, our pinky is most often our most forgotten finger. And a lot of times it can be hard to, incorporate it into some of the stuff that we're doing. But you can hear it has this really, really interesting sound to it, right? It brings something completely new to your guitar playing and to your harmony, And then, you know, I've used this analogy before, but it really like makes your guitar sound like it's kind of living. It has a very active role within the music, and you can still make melodies, which I really, really like. And you'll notice too, obviously I wouldn't do this on every chord, because then I'd probably be occupying too much space, right? If I was working with a singer or something, then that might not leave a ton of room for them to sing a vocal melody. But I might do just a simple little, just kind of hammer-on motion that we talked about earlier, where I'm just like, in this case, I'm playing it first with my pinky down on the 5th fret of the B string, and then lifting it up, right? Right, so that would be the 6th within the context of G, so this is almost like I'm making it a 6th chord and then just a normal triad, or in this case, I'm doing a sus chord, because I'm taking the 3rd and I'm obscuring it. I'm saying we're going to ignore the 3rd, let me put my pinky down and play this C note, which is going to keep it from resolving back to a major chord. So you can see I've only been playing one chord for this entire demonstration, and I've already made it sound completely different in a bunch of different contexts, right? Which is, you know, something, again, that I really, really like about this style of playing, is it gives us freedom to do all this different stuff. And then the other thing with a lot of these chords is, even when I'm playing bar chords from this point often, I do the Jimi Hendrix style of playing bar chords. And I don't recommend this for everyone. You know, when he first did this, people instantly said it was wrong. And it's still, you know, as a teacher, I do sometimes see it and I'm like, that is such a weird way of playing the guitar. But electric guitar is an instrument that at its conception was really breaking all the rules, right? Electric guitars were really just, when they started out, acoustic guitars that used amplification to get louder, and things like distortion were, you know, those were issues, those were problems that were turned into a sound and a part of the instrument. So even though it is a little bit rule breaking, or it might be seen as an improper technique, you know, it's on an instrument that was born a rule breaker, so I don't necessarily see it as a huge problem. So for this chord, all I'm doing is, to do this technique, you generally do have to sometimes have bigger hands, but you have to get comfortable wrapping your thumb around, and then it's kind of just on the edge of your thumb on the knuckle. Since it's a little bit of a bigger finger, all I have to do is wrap my thumb around and I can get that. So that does two things. For one, it skips the A string, so you'll notice, even though I'm only skipping one note here, you know, this note adds so much power and low-end information to the chord, which can be great in some contexts, but like I said, if I'm playing with a piano player, I might not necessarily want all that lower stuff in what I'm doing. So doing this chord still gives me that root note, still gives me a little bit of low end, but it's not, you know, overpowering the rest of the chord like it might within this voicing. And it also frees up my pinky finger, so I can do all those fun trills and stuff that I was talking about. So that's within the context of this major chord, right? And it would be the same thing with our minor chord. I won't demonstrate that because I'll let you play around with it. Let's talk about how we could do it with this major voicing, right? So another reason I liked this this one finger approach right here is because it frees up all of these other pinkies. Not all my other pinkies. I only have one. Well, I have two pinkies, but on this hand I have one, obviously. So on this hand, it frees up all these other fingers so that I can do more of these trills. And within this context, I only have my pinky free. Now I've got my other fingers free, and there are other notes that can work within this. So what I'm gonna do, right, this is my major chord. If you noticed what I just did there, here, I'll actually skip that note since that would make it a different scale, and I don't want to talk too much about modes at this moment. So I'll make that as my trill. I'm basically just incorporating. I'm incorporating other notes that are within the major scale, right? And you can already hear again, right? That sounds like a melody in itself. But now, if I bar my first finger, it has this whole other feel to it because I'm barring this first finger and I'm using it to create double stops. So again, with that kind of little wing association we have with Jimi's rhythm playing, where he's incorporating lead and rhythm guitar at the same time, this is a really, really useful avenue to take where I'm playing a major chord, right? This has all the notes I need within my major chord. But now, I can do all these double stops with it, and now my chord is meeting my lead playing, which I really like. So to play that little run that I was doing, again, I'm playing the 5th fret of D, G, and B. I'm just going through, and I'm basically, every time I need to add a new note, I'm changing up a fingering, I'm just playing the whole chord. So I start with this chord, then I'm putting my ring finger down on the 7th fret of D, I lift it up, I put my ring finger down on the 7th fret of G, lift it up, and then my middle finger goes down on the 6th fret of B, and then up for the chord again. Right? So it's a really, really interesting run. It gives a whole, dynamic element to your rhythm playing. And it's really kind of, like I said, it's incorporating some higher register information, which is really useful as guitar players when we want to create something that feels like it's contrary to what a piano player is doing, right? It gives us a little bit more freedom in occupying different territories, and it gets at one of my favorite things that comes about with rhythm guitar. I love lead playing, but rhythm guitar is always going to be my favorite style and my favorite thing to do within a song. And part of that is because a lot of times people think it's just taking a back seat and playing chords. But the more you get comfortable with the style, the more you're noticing, I have all of these different options as to what note I can make my top note in a chord. And in doing that, I can create melodies with my chord because, I've talked about this a little bit before. Whenever you play a major chord, typically the highest note within that chord is going to be the note that, our ear is drawn to. It's not that we're not going to hear the other notes, but if I was to, put together something where I'm playing all of these different chords, that higher note is what I'm going to perceive. So if I start playing some of these melodies together within a chord shape, I can now create my own counter melody to what a vocalist is doing, or just some little embellishments that feel very melodic in nature. So again, that's why I really appreciate this style of music and why, I fell in love with people like Jimi Hendrix when I heard his playing, because, even though he was singing or, accompanying something else happening within the song, his guitar playing felt so living and breathing, and it felt like there were all of these little different melodies woven into what he was doing, even though it was probably still considered rhythm guitar, right? So this is kind of just a nice introduction to that world, and as well a good introduction into all that higher register information. And I'll play you the example that I made today that I think is a good demonstration of, this style in particular and how it comes up in, some modern music and some old school music at the same time. But another type of music that I think is really, really important to understand the style is reggae. And part of the reason is because, there are different styles of playing on the and of a beat, which is where reggae typically happens, which means typically when I'm counting music, if I was to think about eighth notes, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and I was playing on the downbeat of all those, right? Right when if I was counting that, right when my foot would be hitting the ground. And typically in reggae, what we're doing is we're playing on the and of a beat. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And these chords are really nice because you'll notice what I'm doing here is typically whenever we're strumming eighth notes, we go down, up, down, up, down, up. Now, if you play punk music, you might do all downstrokes, and even Bob Marley himself used a lot of downstrokes. So this is not, the end-all be-all rule for playing reggae, but a lot of times, if you'll notice, if I'm going 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, I'm coming up on every and, right? So that means I'm up-picking. And these chords are really great when you're just up-picking because you'll notice, to up-pick a whole entire major chord, on all 6 strings can be kind of awkward. So these voicings can actually be really nice for that because they have that higher, register information, which is really, really accustomed to a lot of the different reggae styles, right? If you listen to a lot of different reggae songs, there are usually, or not, always, but they do often have 2 guitar players or, they have an organ player or a piano player, and the guitar player is doing something that's a little bit higher up. So this style of thinking about chords is really useful for that. because I might, you know, if I'm playing on the end of every beat, it might be easiest to up-pick those, and as I'm up-picking those, I'm really just anyway focusing on those, you know, top 4 notes. So even if I was to up-pick normally and play this voicing, you know, my standard major chord voicing, you can hear it's really only from my D string to my high E string that's ringing out. So that's another one of the that's another really great applications of this. It's very different from the Jimi Hendrix style and association we have with using these 4-note chords, but you know, again, a very important application of these, and you know, demonstrates where they come up with in music. So let me actually play the example that I came up with today. It's kind of in the style of artists like Alabama Shakes, who are obviously modern artists and they do a lot of really groundbreaking stuff, but a lot of their style is a callback to kind of the, you know, old school 1970s and 60s, you know, slow 6/8, 12/8 styles of guitar playing with, you know, really soulful vocals, just amazing songwriting. So you'll hear I'm kind of doing a little bit something that's kind of in the style of that, or maybe artists like John Mayer as well. But I'm really showcasing why these, you know, upper structure and upper register voicings, you know, have a great application. So let me play this for you. Let's pull up my track. So that was it. Super simple, but you can hear the difference in sound that I'm now getting because I'm using these upper structure chords, right? So just right off the bat, this song is in 6/8. So in case you were kind of confused by how the metronome was working, because you could hear it, you know, it wasn't in a group of 4. The way we're thinking about this is with 6/8, it's saying that every measure has 6/8 notes to it. So the way that I count this is 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. And you'll hear, the reason I'm saying 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3 is just because when you count up to 6, if I was going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it can just be a little hard to keep track of, and I just like the 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, as do a lot of people. So that's what I use when I'm counting 6/8. And it also helps too because, you know, I kind of, like I said, I've talked about this before, but I always kind of feel 6/8 as a back and forth motion. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. Almost like a pendulum. So as I play this, you can hear 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3 on that beat 4, right? That's actually where, you know, you kind of hear the hits, and that happens a lot with 6/8. That's kind of, you know, where we feel the emphasis, because 6/8 can also be felt as this very slow 1, 2, 1, 2, right? Almost like this, you know, you could think about it in 2 or 4 or something like that. But those are really where we hear the emphasis, and a lot of times if you were to tell somebody who wasn't as comfortable in a time signature like this, they might hear that as the beat, but our subdivision should be that little 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3. And I'd encourage you to kind of lock in with that, because if you just try to lock in with a 1, 2, it'll be, you know, that's too slow in my mind to really be able to, you know, groove with it. And you always should, especially at slower tempos, feel the subdivision so that you can lock in with what the drums are doing. So, right off the bat, we're starting with a G major chord, right? And I'm coming in on beat 4 with this. So I have my ring finger here on the 5th fret of the D string. My middle finger's here on the 4th fret of the G string. My first finger is here on the 3rd fret of the B string. And then it is also barring across so that it gets the 1st fret of the high E string. And I'm just doing these pretty aggressive upstrokes, right? Because I want it to sound really, really tight. That's part of this style, is just locking in directly with the drum. So as soon as the drummer plays that kick drum, I'm directly up, and you can hear the other thing that happens. I'm not doing this. I'm not letting the chord ring out. So something to get used to, especially with these upper register voicings, is right when I want the sound to stop, I'm lifting up my fingers. Now that doesn't mean I'm going like this and taking them off the guitar. All it means is my fingers stay in place, but I just stop pressing them down. And this is another really great habit to be working on with guitars. Every time I play a chord, you know, my resting position is not having the chord pressed down. My resting position is having my fingers just right where they need to be. That way, I can push down right when I want the chord to sound, and then I can just lightly lift up right when I want it to stop. So getting in that habit is a really, really, you know, great thing to do, because it gives you way more control in where your chord starts and where it stops. So if you want something that feels very tight like this, you know, that's exactly the technique we need to use to achieve that. So that's our first chord. 2, 3, 2, 3, 2. For our next one, this is going to be a D chord. So this was typically our D bar chord, but we're going to do that little simple 3-note version that I talked about. So that's the 5th fret of the D string, the 7th fret of the D string, the 7th fret of the G string, and the 7th fret of the B string. I'm also up-picking that, and with that one you might need to be a little bit more careful, because I can't just, you know, up-pick the entire guitar. You know, I maybe could, but I want to try to avoid that high E string if I can. So I'm just up-picking from the B string on. So we have our 1 chord. Then we have our 5 chord, which is D. And then I'm just going to go down to my 4 chord, which is C, and that's just the same exact thing. I'm just barring the 5th fret of D, G, and B, right? So again, you'll notice this is a really simple progression. G, C, D, it's been used a million times. It's called a 1-4-5, but now that we're kind of doing all this different stuff to it, it has a whole, you know, new sound to it. It's got a really different light to it. And that's just one of the beautiful things about this style of guitar playing, is it can really, you know, take something that's very familiar, or, you know, it might sound like an old tired trope, and we're really kind of rethinking it in a different way. So that's my whole A section, is just my 1 chord, my 5 chord, and my 4 chord. Now for our second part, here's what we're going to do. We're going to also play major chords, and if you notice, I was playing C and D before. I'm actually going to be playing C and D again, but now I'm thinking about them up here. So now, this same G chord I was doing up here, I'm going to do up here. And there's also something else that I'm doing. I'm actually omitting the high E string for the second chord. So I'll show you that as I go into it. But for this C chord, I have my ring finger here on the 10th fret of the D, my middle finger here on the 9th fret of the G, my first finger here on the 8th fret of the B, and then it's also barring across so that it gets the 8th fret of the high E. So again, pretty simple there, just doing an upstroke and doing it with the same rhythm that I'm doing the other ones. And now when I go up to this D chord, I'm just walking down this triad. So it's the same exact voicing minus the high E string. So that makes it the 10th fret of B, the 11th fret of G, and the 12th fret of D. And I'm just sliding it up and going from the B string to the G string to the D string one by one. That way it gives it, you know, a little bit of this living and breathing element that we've talked about with these chords. Again, doing the same thing with both of these, where after I play the chord and I want it to deaden, I'm just lifting my fingers up so they're no longer imprinting on the guitar strings. So that's it. That's my entire A section and my entire B section. Again, this one's really simple, but it gives you, you know, a nice variety of things to work on. It gives you, you know, this 6/8 feel where I really have to feel that subdivision, and I can get comfortable with the style of playing where, you know, I'm imprinting my fingers only when I want the chord to sound, and then kind of having them just, you know, I have the chord fingered, but I'm not pressing them down when I'm in my resting position. And then also, again, working on upstrokes and working on all these different upper structure chords. So let's try this once more over the backing track. Great. So that was, again, our whole progression. Hopefully it's a little bit more simple than some of the other stuff we're doing. We're really just focusing on some basics there. But again, this whole lesson was just focusing in on how we can incorporate some of these upper structure chords. We were just working with triads today, so just simply major and minor chords. We didn't do any diminished or any of that stuff. And we were just seeing how can we voice all these chords from the D string up to the high E string. That way we can either create something that'd be contrary to another guitar player or to a piano player or something like that. It could allow us to play a style where I'm using a lot of up picks, or, it can also just free up some of my other fingers so that I can create melodies with them. So given all that, if you have any questions on today's lesson or anything chord related, anything we've talked about in the course or anything we haven't talked about in the course, please pass that along and we can get those answered for you in our Q&A.
All right, we're back. So any comments or questions you have on today's lesson, anything you want me to go back over, anything you want me to clarify, or anything from even, some of the previous lessons or just guitar in general that you'd like me to talk about, just ask away and I'll get those answered for you. So let's see, it looks like we've got one coming in here. Let me just scroll this. All right. Do these upper structure chords have anything to do with the caged system? All right, cool. This is a great question. So for those of you that don't know, the caged system is, this kind of chord system that a lot of us apply, or that's often used with guitar, and it's pretty much doing essentially what we're doing right now with the guitar. It's saying, when I'm in the first position with all these chords, and I have my open D chord, my open A chord, my open C chord, and I run into that problem that we talked about where, if this is C and I wanted to play C sharp, well, all of a sudden, right, that G's not moving when it would need to move. So basically what the caged system says is it's basically a system of how can I move up these positions, right? These little upper structure positions, and think about them within different contexts so that I could actually think about a D sharp, right? So I might need to imagine this chord in that case, where I'm actually moving up this D note with it, right? And so in using the cage system, basically what we're doing is we're saying, how can I relate these positions to different parts of the neck? Now, I don't use the kind of comprehensive cage system. If we were to do the cage system, that outline is C, A, G, E, D. That's why we call it caged, because it's all of those different chords, right? And there are some contexts where, for instance, like the G chord, we could kind of come up with these different versions as I move up a G major shape, where again, I'm trying to think about this position, but how can I move it up? That aren't extremely useful, at least in the way that I'm picturing it. So what I will do is I'll talk about the context in, so getting back to the question of how does this to relate to what we were talking about today, right? When we're talking about some of these upper structure chords, so for instance, when I was playing something like a C major, but I was just using these chords, right? And I was just using these three notes to compose a C major chord. This is actually really, really similar to to an A chord, right? So this is actually the cage system at work right now, and this bar chord that we typically do is a very, very good example of the A within the caged system, right? So we're trying to say, how can I take this open position chord and move it up to a different part within the guitar? So if I wanted to move it up, I'd have to be moving this A note along with it. So essentially when I'm doing something like this, right, I'm just relating it back to my A position chord. So that is essentially like what the cage system is getting at. And like I said, I don't use it where I'm thinking about every single individual chord, C, A, E. You know, some of them don't always kind of carry over in a way that I like, so I don't always teach it as the cage system, but that's the general thinking behind it. And especially with something like D major, you know, if you wanted to play, for instance, an E major, but you wanted to play it a little higher up, well, if I just made sure to only play the G string, B string, and E string, I could take my whole D major position up a half step and just omit the D string. Right? So it's a very, very useful way of thinking, and all it's trying to do is relating, you know, all of our positions in the guitar together, which is something that's really good, because a lot of times as guitar players, we'll tend to memorize a position or memorize something in a song, but we won't really always be relating it to, you know, other things we know on the guitar. So cage system is really interesting. We have a lot of course material if you want to go further into that, even though I haven't specifically talked about it. So I definitely recommend looking up some of that if this seemed interest to you. And if not, hopefully we can just go along and carry on how we're doing it. All right, we've got another question. When you're playing melodies and embellishments around the chords, are you thinking of them in a scale? How do you know which notes will work? So that's a great question. Typically, I am thinking about it within a scale, and you know, this takes some kind of theory and know-how. Basically, the way that I'll think about it is if I'm in the key of C major, right? So if I'm in the key of C major and I'm playing chords, I have to be able to visualize my C major scale all over the fretboard. And this is actually, this kind of gets a little bit at that cage system, and this is something that's helpful. So what I can imagine is if I'm playing a D minor chord, which is in the second chord within the key of C major, right? I can still visualize my C major scale there, right? So in doing that, if I was to play my D minor chord, right, I was able to play all those notes effectively because I was within the key of C major, so I know any of those notes are going to work when I'm playing my D minor chord. And now, you know, this can be a little bit of a conceptual leap, because if you were like, okay, I need to learn, you know, my C major scale basically in the 7 positions or 5 positions, depending on how you would think about it, right? I would need to learn that all over my neck, and that can take some time. But the other thing that kind of happens with this is the more you learn this embellishment style, the more you kind of associate these sweet spots and these licks associated with each chord, right? And as much as I know that when I'm playing this, I'm playing the C major scale, but I am thinking more about licks generally when I do these embellishments anyway, just because, you know, I've played enough stuff now where I'm comfortable knowing all those notes are going to work over this minor chord if I was playing the 2 or the 3. So I would just joining back. Okay, cool. So we're back. So I'm not 100% sure where that dropped off in my last question, but all that to say, just kind of focus on the embellishments that I talked about within today's lesson, because those are a really, really great starting point, and they're where I started out with guitar, right? All those little kind of Jimi Hendrix voicings and Jimi Hendrix scales that he's doing within a chord. And then hopefully as you kind of grow your repertoire of those little embellishments with chords, you can connect the scale to it. All right, and we have another question. Do you have any tips for muting the 5th and 6th string? I have trouble hitting those and having them ring out. So, depends on how you're thinking about it. Some people consider this the 5th and 6th strings. Some people consider this the 5th and 6th string. Given the fact that we were playing mainly on the upper structure chords for this, I'm guessing it was the E and A string. So there's a couple things that go into this. For one, it's how I'm picking at the strings. So I'm being really, really, cognizant of when I'm doing anything like this. You can see I'm really, really focusing in with my pick and making sure I'm only hitting the D string on. And actually this gets at something else, because you might be saying to yourself, okay, that sounds great, but it's really, really hard to kind of hold my hand in place and focus it on just the D string. And I feel like if I'm not looking, it's really easy to accidentally hit the open E or open A string. So something that kind of gets at that is a lot of times we do what I like to call levitating. I see it a lot in people, and it's where I'm just holding my hand right here over the guitar, but I'm not really kind of anchoring anything on the guitar. When that happens, you'll notice even the slightest movement in my shoulder is going to affect my picking hand, and I don't want that. That's a really large chain reaction that I'm not interested in kind of working around. So you'll notice when I put my hand on the guitar, I'm not, completely palm muting at all times when I play, but you'll notice my resting position is pretty much with my hand and my wrist on the bridge, and this does a couple of things. For one, you'll notice, like I said, I'm not completely palm muting, but if you listen to that, it's a little bit muted, right? So for one, it's going to ensure that even if I do hit one of these strings, it's going to deaden it just a tiny bit. And then the really important part about this is you'll notice it really removes that kind of, that wiggling that we might have if our arm's not on the guitar. So if I'm making sure that this part of my hand's on the guitar, all I really need to worry about is this part of my hand on, right? I'm no longer worrying about my whole entire arm. I'm just worrying about my hand on. And when that's the case, it's a lot easier, in my opinion, to rest on the string that you need to be playing. So you'll notice when I do that, right, it's really easy now to kind of know where that D note is and feel comfortable with it. And then the last thing that kind of goes into this, which can be, this might be a little bit too much to think about, but, it's kind of like having a bunch of different fail safes. That's kind of how I treat muting in, not having notes ring out that you don't want to ring out. So I have my hand slightly touching the strings here. I'm making sure to kind of shorten the distance between, what is anchored on the guitar and what's playing the strings. And then lastly, I also, if you'll notice, a lot of times when I'm doing these, I'll have some of my other fingers just covering the E and A string. Again, this is something that kind of becomes second nature, and it might be hard, if you're just trying to get the basic voicings down. I wouldn't worry too much about this, but this is kind of the last fail safe. Just in case, all else failed, I can still have my middle finger or my ring finger down here to mute those strings. So see if you can use a combination of those things. I think the core of it is really getting your hand and this part of your palm to rest on the guitar. That way you don't have to worry too much about, I'm losing my string or I'm kind of losing my place, because again, you're going to minimize the amount of movement your hand can actually do. All right, and that looks like it is all of our questions. So for this week, just see if you can get some of those basic voicings down. Again, hopefully this is a little bit, theoretically it makes a little more sense than our last lesson. We're kind of going back to the basics again and just saying, how can I create some new cool major chord and minor chord voicings that I could use, in combination with another guitar that would just, increase some of the higher frequency stuff that we have on the instrument. So see if you can get some of these under your hands, and when you feel comfortable, see if you can also include some of those embellishments, because they're a really, really cool part of rhythm guitar playing, and they're what made me fall in love with all things rhythm guitar. So thanks again for staying throughout the whole entire lesson, and I'll see you in the next episode.